Thanks, Catherine and Carl, for having me. It's a real honour to be invited today. The guys at Prosper have also really helped me broaden my thinking in the last few years when I've been involved in doing research with them. They've started many interesting discussions, and I recommend to you all listening to Carl's 3CR Renegade Economist podcast that I listen to each week. It really helps expand your thinking. If you want to think about housing, if you want to think about economic rent, if you want to think about just getting a fair go from our natural resources, that's a go-to thing for me. So today, I'll put my stopwatch on so we don't go too far off track. Today, I also want to try and expand your thinking. I want to do what Prosper has done for me and pass on new ways of thinking. And let me start with the first big lesson that I got when I read Henry George. The big lesson for me was that most of our major economic problems stem from the unequal distribution of the ownership of capital. What George said, and what I remember, and I'm paraphrasing, was that how can there be unemployment if every household has their own plot of land to work and to farm? How can there be involuntary unemployment? And that really struck home with me. Maybe it doesn't for you, but I just thought, wow, isn't that amazing? And what if that's the same problem we have with housing? If everyone owned their own home, could there be a housing affordability problem? Because I know people who bought their house decades ago are living in free housing. If we all had that, I wouldn't be here tonight talking to you. So those lessons are powerful. So let's go into more detail and then do something that I believe is almost never done, is to actually talk about making land and housing cheaper, perhaps even free. That's what I think we should be talking about. And to make my case, we need to take a few detours and we need to use our imagination. So let's imagine there's a market with monopoly characteristics that is an essential input to everyone's modern life. The high prices charged by monopolist suppliers are making life extremely difficult for the neediest in society, who often go without life's basics to cover their costs. One group of people, the experts, think the solution to this problem is to make markets work. They see complex market failures all around that are not only difficult to understand, but extremely difficult to combat. But they want to try wherever they can to fix these failures little by little. Another group, the radicals, think the solution is to break the market. They say that fundamentally this industry will never overcome its monopoly problem and market failures, and a totally different approach is needed. They argue that instead of market provision, everyone should get what they need for free. Not only that, the government should raise $100 billion in extra taxes each year to do it. The experts, the Make Markets Work team, laugh at how implausible this is. That's over 6% of GDP. How could it even be possible to give people such a gargantuan freebie? How would anyone vote for it? No, it's much better to make markets work and tinker around the edges. The experts release report after report showing how their proposals might reduce costs by a few percent here and a few percent there. That is apparently the best we can aim for. Luckily, with the exception of the United States, the second group, the radicals, who want to break the market, won the debate. Universal public health care has been established in just about every rich country. Australia and Canada's Medicare system, the French and British National Health Services, just about every rich country decided that provisioning universal access to quality health care for free was a basic function of a modern wealthy country. In healthcare, we solved the monopoly problem by breaking the market. We spend $100 billion of our tax money to do it, and we are all better for it. Now let's talk about land. And we're continuing our detour, and we're first going to think abstractly about a particular type of land where two roadways cross, an intersection. Imagine living a century ago in 1918 and seeing the massive social failures at road intersections. Fatal accidents, congestion, we've had it tonight. People have been late. The rich with their fancy motor carriages zooming dangerously past the poor with their horse and hand-drawn carts. Being a common sense person, you see this situation and propose a non-market solution of taking turns to freely access that intersection using a system of electronic lights run by a public government agency. If you tried to propose this system today, you'd be labelled as mad. You know it's true, don't you? The make markets work crowd, the experts, the economic consultants, we know they would call us mad because their modern solution to traffic congestion is to price roads. That's the only thing we can do, make markets work. A public rationing system is complete nonsense, they would say. And yet, every country in the world thinks the best thing to do on all our public roadways is not to have a little auctioneer there letting the rich people cross, but to take turns accessing it for free. Remember this, okay? Turn taking. It's innate. Every parent at the playground teaches their child not to bribe other kids for a turn at the swings, but to take turns. Even the experts force their children to do this, even though their theories say it's nonsense to do so, and the kids should take wads of cash to the market and bid at auction for the swings. They would never... I know, when you think about it in the abstract, it can be a little bit crazy. So we can finish this detour now. Our brains are switched on, we're thinking abstractly. Let's talk about land for housing. I've got another story. We're going to get to the point. And I just want to reinforce how crazy it is the way we talk about housing. You are an explorer and you stumble across an island society with 4 families. 3 of them appear to own their homes and control all of the land on the island. 1 family does not. I'll call them the Murrays, so you can remember. Another family, we'll just call them the Smiths, although I thought about calling them the Turnbulls or the Morrisons. They house the Murrays, who have nowhere else to go for an exorbitant fee. No matter what the Murrays do, how hard they work, what they earn, their landlord is able to extract most of the economic gains they make. After all, these other families hold the land monopoly. Now, do you think to yourself, as an inquisitive and thoughtful explorer, why can't this society just cooperate and give the Murrays a plot of land for their own home rather than extorting them for a large chunk of their income? Or do you think, look at the Murrays enjoying the spoils of markets at work? Because I can tell you, when the experts and the economics profession see this society 1,000,000 times magnified across Australia, they think B, look at the magic of the property market at work. They have nothing to offer the Murrays. In fact, the current policy advice from many of these experts is for our island society to do nothing, or at best perhaps subsidise the Smiths for housing the Murrays. This is exactly what our discounts, for example, on developer charges are. It doesn't seem like a solution to me. Or perhaps we could give the Murrays more money to specifically spend on housing. But wouldn't that just go straight into the pocket of the Smiths? We have those schemes too. They're called first homeowners grants. Or what if we were actually serious? Maybe we could limit the rent paid to something like 25% of the Murray's income. We have such schemes as well. The National Rental Affordability Scheme. But even then, 25% of someone's gross income is a long way from the 0% that the other families pay for their housing. What this story shows, I hope, is that why home ownership makes sense. Home ownership provides secure, non-market priced housing in perpetuity. It provides us a way to escape the monopoly land market. We essentially buy our way out and we get free housing for life. That's what the benefit of home ownership is. So when we think about making housing affordable, we should be thinking about escaping the market. Now, when we return to the real world and we talk about affordable housing, we need to be really careful with what we say, because quite often the term affordable housing is used to avoid confronting the reality that making land cheaper is the only effective way to operationalize that objective. It's a way to pretend we want to do something without actually having to admit to ourselves what we need to do. I've had conversations with politicians at all levels about housing policy before. Let me check. I usually ask them, how much would you like prices to fall? 20%? 30%? 50%? They usually say, no. I don't want prices to fall. I just don't want prices to grow as fast as they have been. I mean, seriously, this is the ambition of our most concerned politicians. And I'm going to name names. I remember talking to John Alexander for almost 2 hours, the Liberal member for Bennelong, who was actually genuinely concerned about making housing affordable. He's probably one of the more thoughtful and genuine politicians to try and tackle the issue. But he didn't want prices to fall. He had in mind a complicated financial scheme that would funnel foreign borrowing into new property. But specifically, his objective, and this is serious, was for prices to rise at only 5% per year instead of 10% per year for many decades. And I asked him whether he actually understood what that meant. I said, do you know what the median price in 10 years will be if it grows at 5%? It'll be 60% higher. If wages grow 2%, housing's still 33% more expensive under your ambitious housing affordability plan than they are now. But he felt like there was no other option. And then I asked him, what happens if prices fall 20% in the meantime due to market cycles? This situation was apparently undesirable. Prices must rise and the market must be rescued. And now I think we should be clear, if we're going to talk about affordable housing, we should just avoid the phrase and say something like cheap housing. We don't talk about grocery affordability or petrol affordability. We talk about cheap food and cheap petrol. But regardless of how you talk about it, what I mean when I say affordable housing is I want the price of secure housing, housing where you get to decide how long you stay in that home, to be less, to be lower. And at the limit, I want to make housing free. I think if we all had owned our own home, we wouldn't have this affordability problem. And in actual fact, 3 million households out of the 10 million in this country already have that free housing. Those who'd bought their houses decades ago or inherited houses get free housing. It's only the 2.7 million households who currently rent that we need to focus on. In fact, our housing affordability problem is 1/3 solved. Another third owns their home with a mortgage, and half of them paid a small fraction of what homes are worth now, so for them, it's mostly solved as well. So really, when we're talking about housing affordability, what we're doing is we're thinking about 2.7 million renting households who currently pay around $50 billion per year to the 1.5 million landlords in this country. If we wanted to, we could just pay everybody's rent at a cost of $50 billion per year. That's half the price, or half the cost rather, of our public health system. You could get free housing for half price. If we wanted to pay the interest bill on those who are paying off their home with a mortgage, that's $60 billion per year. So we could give people who are paying off their home and people who are renting free housing for $110 billion per year. Almost exactly what we pay on public health care, and 100% of households would be living in free housing. That's our benchmark. When we talk about affordable housing, that's where we should be aiming. And we should negotiate back from there. We shouldn't be saying, oh, make the rent 25% of income. I mean, what do you gain taking the rent from 30% to 25% for a few thousand households? Almost nothing. I wouldn't even call it an affordability policy. The other thing we can do when we talk about making housing cheaper is we can forget about the market price. We didn't make public health care free because we manipulated the price that pharmaceutical companies charge, or that our X-ray machines cost, or that our hospitals cost to build. We don't have to change that price. We just have to start a system that we can all agree upon that provisions housing for free or for very little. And yet no one talks like this. Nobody. The experts are nowhere near this. At best, they want to reduce prices by 10% in 10 years' time. Like, that's the ambition. The housing policy environment right now, I would best describe it as busy work. Good intentions, plenty of noise and activity, achieving nothing. Making plans, to have an inquiry, to make recommendations, to create a task force, and around the merry-go-round we go. Some academics have been trying to operate objectively in this fog of academic self-delusion. Nicole Gurin and Peter Phibbs published an article entitled, "Are Governments Really Interested in Fixing the Housing Problem? Policy Capture and Busy Work in Australia," which answered their question in the negative. Let me give you an example. Here are some plans to make plans that we've had in Australia in the last couple of decades about housing. We had the Prime Ministerial Task Force on Home Ownership in 2003, the Productivity Commission First Home Ownership Report in 2004, the A Good House is Hard to Find report from the Senate Select Committee on Housing Affordability in 2008, Western Australia's Housing Affordability Strategy. We've had 7 National Housing Supply Council State of the Supply reports. We had the 2014-15 Senate inquiry into affordable housing and a parliamentary inquiry into home ownership in 2015, and my list goes on, but I'm not even going to say them. And prices went up 75% in Sydney in the 5 years from 2012, even after all of that. All these reports have in common an economic framework that sees the Murrays in our island society and admires the markets at work. The mainstream economists who dominate these inquiries, reports and policy busy work have nothing to offer the question of affordable housing, as they have really no deep understanding of land markets. The profession's pet theories expressly assume away the monopoly characteristics of land market, leaving them able to at best waffle aimlessly, stringing together loaded economics jargon like competition, elasticity, equilibrium, all the while saying nothing. In short, we have a policy fraud built on an intellectual fraud, intentional or not. We have policy analysts, think tanks, academics, and commentators who battle the power of pharmaceutical and healthcare monopolies by proposing to take away their pricing power and implement non-market systems. And at the same time, these groups ignore the pricing power of land monopolists, even boosting it with more gifts, grants, and subsidies. These people probably sit in adjacent cubicles, taking radically different approaches to the same economic problem. And I'm looking at the Grattan Institute in particular when I think about this. They're really good on healthcare, but not on land. We know land is a monopoly for two reasons. First, it comprises only the right, not the obligation, to be put to use. Okay? You can own land and there's no punishment for not using it. It's not like you produce tomatoes and once they're produced you have to get out there and sell it and use it, right? Second, there's no free entry. You cannot compete in land markets using inputs that are not also outputs of the same land market. You cannot create land without using land as your input. It's not like I can create a competing hairdresser by getting a new, different place and hire new, different people and provide these services. If I want to supply land, I have to first buy it off someone who already owns it and has no obligation to do anything with it. And yet it's totally ignored. Henry George knew it. He said, "What is it then that prevents labour from employing itself on this land? Simply that it has been monopolised and held at speculative prices based not upon present value, but upon the added value that will come with the future growth of population." Now, this is actually what modern real options theory says. Don't build housing unless it beats waiting to build something different in the future. And don't sell unless you're sure the future options are inferior to cashing out now. So we have the right economic theory, it's just that none of the experts want to pay attention to it. And the fundamental, puzzle here is that even standard theory says that once you accept this land is a monopoly, our standard economics says you can regulate the price down to the marginal cost with no detrimental effects. That's what we do in all sorts of monopoly industries, in rail lines, in pipelines, and all that sort of stuff. We set regulated prices at the marginal cost of using that, and if we did the same thing with land because we acknowledged it was a monopoly, we would set the efficient market price at zero. That's what it says. All we have to do is accept that the market in land is a monopoly. And the greatest policy fraud is built on this theoretical fraud. And it's what I call the supply side distraction. Now, I'm going to target Brendan Coates in particular from Grattan, who presented recently about this. And he presented something called "Supply skeptics beware, without more housing, it won't be affordable." Sounds very ominous. But here's his conclusion. Building an extra 50,000 homes a year for a whole decade could see prices 10, maybe 15% lower. To me, that's less exciting than John Alexander's outcome of prices rising 5% instead of 10%. Now, I know Brennan really cares about it, but like all others, he ignores the land monopoly. A frank and honest approach would see that in the 3 months to July 2015, Sydney home prices already grew 10%. And their proposal is to reverse those 3 months' growth with a decade-long record high construction program. And what's the economic cost of this low ambition supply side distraction? It would be a 25% increase in the already high number of homes being built each year of over 200,000. which is enough to accommodate 500,000 people. We're currently building a new Newcastle worth of homes a year, and we would need to add to that a new Ballarat, Toowoomba or Darwin's worth every 10 years to reduce prices by just the amount they grew in 3 months in 2015. Some suburbs of Sydney have seen prices fall by more than that in the past year just from tightening credit. It's a colossal investment task for a minute reduction in housing costs. And let's think about those real costs in more detail. Currently, 9.5% of the labour force produces those 200,000 homes, which was actually only 7.5% prior to the financial crisis. So to meet the extra supply we need, the extra 50,000, we would need to take 2.5% of the workforce from what they're doing, tell them to stop doing that and come and build houses for us for 10 years. That's the workforce of the whole ACT or the labour force of the Gold Coast that we would need to tell them, stop doing what you're doing, build housings, because we think the supply side distraction is our best solution. And all we get is a 10% effect. What's even worse about this is that this distraction doesn't actually involve building any new homes. It involves making minor tweaks to planning rules in the hope it will stimulate the biggest construction boom in the history of the nation, where property developers left, right and centre start building thousands of new homes, even though it's reducing their profits because it's enough to reduce prices. It's a bizarre, bizarre story. Not only is the effect tiny, and make therefore an odd objective for affordable housing, but the way to get there is essentially to hope the market works like it does in their flawed model. Anyway, so what's the cost of doing the wrong things? We've got this policy fraud. Captain is the supply side distraction, and what's it cost us? Well, let's look at some of the subsidies we do which go right into the hands of landlords. We have state and federal governments have spent about $1 billion a year on first homeowners grants and hundreds of millions on stamp duty discounts. Capital gains tax exemptions are worth nearly $50 billion a year, and the tax discounts to property investors are around $3 billion a year. We are rezoning land for free rather than charging for it, costing $11 billion a year, chasing this non-solution of hoping land developers build so many houses they crash prices. All up, it's over $60 billion a year in subsidies we spend on things that don't make housing cheaper. And the politics of property is why this fraud is so easy to perpetuate. The simple fact is, making the market price of housing cheaper is a multi-trillion-dollar transfer of wealth. In March 2018, the total value of residential land and dwellings in Australia was a truly astonishing $6.9 trillion. It's hard to fathom these big numbers. It's about 4 years of GDP. It's 4 times more than the market capitalisation of the whole Australian equity market and 6 times the value of the world's highest valued company, Apple. Now let's imagine we did in fact make the market price of housing 25% cheaper. This would take Sydney prices back to where they were in September 2014. If we did that nationally, it would wipe out $1.7 trillion from the balance sheets of over 7 million property-owning households. It would be one of the biggest wealth transfers in history, from an overwhelming majority to a tiny minority of the 3 to 4% of people who actually buy a home in a given year. Reducing prices is political suicide, and politicians know it. I actually often wonder if we have politicians or political parties sophisticated enough to make big changes that reduced home prices. I worry, for example, that Labor's promise to both reduce the capital gains tax discount and require the quarantining of negative gearing losses cannot be fulfilled. We know that when the resources super profits tax on mining was proposed, the government of the day faced extreme pressure from vested interests and caved immediately. So I would ask, what plan does Labor have to combat the vested interests in property development when they too launch a $20 million propaganda blitz against their negative gearing and capital gains tax policies? How serious are they? Do they have advertising agencies lined up? Do they have a sophisticated media and communications team ready to saturate the airwaves to such a degree that vested interests have no breathing room? This is the real fundamental change. We can easily make political promises from opposition, but I don't think they're serious about taking $1.7 trillion of wealth from the 7 million wealthiest households in the country. In my view, it's actually more politically expedient to simply redistribute rental housing from landlords to tenants. It would amount to that same $1.7 trillion transfer of wealth, but instead of from the 7 million home-owning households, it would only be from the 1.5 million landlords. And it would go to the 2.7 million tenants, making a much bigger pool of winners than there are losers, the exact opposite of what making houses cheaper actually does. Twice as many winners as losers. In the reverse, it's 10 times more losers than winners. So if you think reducing the market price of housing by 25% is even remotely politically feasible, then acquiring all homes from landlords and giving them to tenants is almost a done deal, politically speaking. And I'm deadly serious. We could do this. We could shift any outstanding debts onto the central bank's balance sheets, wipe our hands, and have solved housing affordability overnight for at least a generation. So are we serious? Or are we going to pretend that there's any political way to reduce prices significantly? I have a much more modest goal, and that's what the report is about that came out today on the ACT land rent scheme. The more modest goal is just free land for life for all citizens, if they want it. We know in our monopoly housing market, 1/3 of households already have free land. They bought themselves out of the market decades ago. 1/3 have a home with a mortgage, and the most recent buyers pay around 25% of their income on repayments. And another third pays around 21% of their income on rent. A free land option could make available for those who don't already own a home and target these 2.7 million renters. This is not really a new idea. Henry George was a little bit of an inspiration here. He discussed the situation of outside options and their effects on wages. What I'm doing here is discussing the outside option of escaping the monopoly-priced land market and getting access to land for housing for free. This is what Henry George said. Suppose there should arise from the English Channel or the German Ocean a no man's land on which common labour to an unlimited amount could be able to make 10 shillings a day and which should remain unappropriated and free of access. What would be the effect upon wages in England? He would tell you that the common wages must soon increase to 10 shillings a day. What George is imagining here is a new land of free access that will solve unemployment, where wages remain unappropriated. But he lived at a time where governments were small. He couldn't imagine a public health system like we have today, where we spend over $100 billion to make essential services for free. But he understood the need to break the land monopoly with alternative options. He wanted to socialise the land. He wanted to give us our earth rights and our birthrights. So when something is really important, we never rely on markets to provide it. If I haven't made myself clear. We bail out farmers in drought, we provide public education and healthcare, we run the courts, the military, the police, the road system. So what would a turn-taking traffic light system of free access to land for housing look like? Luckily, we have an experiment running since 2008 in the ACT, where over 1,000 households are saving $9 million per year in housing costs and will be 37% better off than renting over 10 years. We're already almost 4 times better than the supply side distraction in terms of the cost of housing. Here, residents who do not already own property are given access to land in new subdivisions, not quite for free, but for a discounted access price of 2% of the market value, with a cap on the growth in the market value set to the local wage index. So the average market price of the block of land that these residents have access to is $275,000. Rather than borrow from the bank a mortgage to get perpetual access to that land and pay over 5% interest, they can instead just pay the government 2%, saving 3% or $9,000 a year. This is massive. In terms of the scale of affordable housing discussion in Australia, this is multiple times better than any other idea going. Providing non-market access to housing. So effective is it that over 2,000 people took up the scheme since it began, and over half of them have left, saving so much money they've decided they actually want the market-priced housing for the capital gains. Such is the power of the housing religion in Australia. If the scheme of this scale had been implemented nationally, it would have created 125,000 homes, housing over 325,000 people, with half going on to buy their own home and the remaining half saving $500 million in housing costs per year. But this amazingly successful land rent scheme only gives residents access to land for the equivalent of a little under half the price. That 2% could just as easily be 1% or 0. If we worried about making land free, we could have a rising block system. If the market value of your land is less than $300,000, you pay 0. If it's over that, you pay 3% land rent on the value above that, just like we have with income tax. If we adopted similar systems nationally or in other states, it's important to get these amounts right early. The ACT has had to refine their scheme over time, and it does upset people who've committed to higher rents. So we need to put some consideration into it, but the benefits are just orders of magnitude larger than anything else we're talking about in housing. And this is even more amazing. The budgetary effect on the ACT government is 0. Because the ACT government retains, it socialises the capital gains that accrue to that land. If a resident dies, a resident leaves the scheme, they can get that market price back. It sits on their books. So that discount that residents get is being offset by socialising the capital gains and sitting on the government balance sheet. So what it shows us is that you can provide land and charge only 2% of the market price with no budgetary effect. So if we wanted to make land free, the subsidy would only be 2% of the market price. I'm going to pause there and I'll revisit the calculation in a minute. There's another way, and I just want to mention it briefly, that I talk about in the report for providing free or heavily discounted land access to residents, and these are called community land trusts. And these are essentially private vehicles that do the same thing. They give residents access at a regulated below market price and never let those capital gains be realised in an open market transaction. In the report, you'll see an analysis of what that scheme could save people in Australia, and we're talking around 50% reduction in housing costs for your typical household if we just picked up the community land trusts and implemented them here. Okay, 5 times better than the supply side policy that seems to be what we're pursuing these days. So let's return to how much free land would cost. That 2% of market value is all it's going to take to subsidise everyone who doesn't own property and give them free land for life. Let's say our target is around 2 million households out of the 2.7 million that don't own a home. Of course, there'll be existing residents who want mobility. There'll be people who don't want to take up this scheme. So let's say our target's 2 million homes. And the average land value at market prices is $300,000. A 2% subsidy to make land for free for 2 million households amounts to just $12 billion per year. That is roughly the value we give away for free through rezoning decisions that could instead be sold. We give this amount away to about half a dozen well-connected property developers every year, and instead we could make land free for anyone who doesn't have land. It's a fifth of the total current subsidies we spend making housing more expensive. Free land is just a dirt cheap policy. Sorry, I've never had a go at stand-up. That was my chance. So how do we get land into the scheme? Now, it's very important. Let's get into the details. I only have a few minutes left. What we need to do is convert land out of the private market and into the scheme without adding extra bidders in the market. It's a bit like acquiring a company. You don't go in the share market and just buy it all and bid up the price. You've got to be smart about it. The ACT has the advantage that it already has a government entity supply all the new residential land. In other states, it can be a bit trickier, although there are still some government developers around. Let's say we want to get 2 million homes in the scheme over 10 years, or 200,000 per year. In the last 10 years, we built 170,000 homes per year. So that's the ambition. We could get the first 250,000 by compulsorily acquiring undeveloped subdivisions from private developers. We know from Prosper's research in their Englobo reports, there are easily 250,000 plots of land ready to be developed on the books of the top 12 land developers in the country. And like the ACT land developer, the new public agency can develop them and give them to people for free. We could get another 250,000 in dense areas using the land agency to acquire whole new buildings from developers who might be struggling to get pre-sales, or simply acquire sites, use publicly owned land and build apartment buildings with the right mix of dwellings for the scheme. Homeowners could convert their own land into the scheme, being paid the assessed value and foregoing future capital gains. If you've recently bought at an inflated price, you might want to get out before prices fall, and if you convert your own land, you're not having an effect on the market. As long as there are controls that restrict the purchases of new buyers, purchases being made after the start date, and having these people bid up the price knowing that they'll be bailed out from this scheme in the future. You could have negotiated agreements between landlords and tenants to convert land into the scheme if the landlords want to cash out. And there are many more ways: deceased estate sales, mortgagees in possession, any particular way you can get land into the scheme without having to outbid someone else and have an effect on the market price that prevails. Now let's think about this politically, because I already said making housing cheaper is a non-starter politically. The beauty of this scheme is it's expressly designed not to change the market price. It's not designed to add extra buyers. It runs in parallel. Just like private insurance companies still make a lot of money while there's a public system, private landholders can still make a lot of money while there's a public system in parallel. It must be more palatable than taking $1.7 trillion from 7 million home-owning households to get a 25% cost saving. Because we know we can get almost 50%. The free land scheme can't be challenged by those who think we need to build more housing to make it cheaper. What could be better than building more housing and giving people it for free? So let me conclude then with how I think we should talk about housing affordability. Our benchmark should be free land for everyone. We never talk about affordability for homeowners because they already have free land. They've escaped the monopoly land market. We should aim high. We shouldn't be talking about 25% of gross income on rent makes housing affordability. That's nonsense. That's about the least ambitious thing you can do. We should call out policy fraud where we see it, those counterproductive policies that get nowhere near making land free and often make housing more expensive. We should simply not let them control the debate, the experts, by agreeing with them when they say how difficult or expensive it would be to make housing affordable. It's not a wicked problem. We should especially ignore anyone whose analysis ignores the land monopoly and talks about market solutions. That is, most of the experts. And we should show that many of our most effective systems are non-market: public health, roads, education, and more. We should emphasize how cheap it is to make land free, even possibly houses for low-income qualifying households. It would cost far less than the current ineffective housing policies we already have that make housing more expensive. And we should never justify policies to make housing cheaper by their budgetary impact, despite the fact I just did that to you. This is admitting defeat before you start. I'll give you an example of how this essentially is a defeat. I met some people doing research on how to clean up ocean plastic and litter on our beaches. And I said, yeah, well, why don't we just not ban straws, but just maybe pick up all the litter, get some ships out there with nets, collect all the litter. And they said, oh yeah, we've looked into that, but it's a bit expensive. It costs like $30,000 to clean a beach. I'm like, okay, $30,000, that is a lot less than we pay to, for example, money managers, to manage our super, the tax breaks we give away. She was admitting defeat. We need to say, this is cheap. We could clean up our beaches for $10 million a year. That's about as much as you need to put a bit of fuel in a jet fighter. We're going to spend billions on that. Wouldn't you rather have clean beaches? We need to get our millions and billions straight and know what's cheap from a social perspective. Okay, the annual GDP is almost $2 trillion. Okay. Anything less than that is anything less than 1.7 trillion in lost asset value for decreasing prices 25% is cheap. Regardless, politicians also like expensive policy sometimes. It's a good way to say they're investing billions in housing. Think about the jobs. So don't give away that argument before you have it. Let me finish by quoting Henry George. He identified the political problem. He said, everywhere in all times, among all peoples, the possession of land is the base of aristocracy, the foundations of fortunes, the source of power. Thank you for listening. I look forward to your interesting questions and discussions.
Cam's talked about taking a few dog legs on the story tonight, and the free land one is what Cam hit me with yesterday, and I was like, wow, okay, that's going to cause some controversy here. But this report, Unspoken Alternatives to Expensive Housing, has the two rigid policies in there of community land trusts and the Canberra Land Rent Initiative. Both of those have processes in place to ensure that the allocated efficiency of these scarce resources is maintained. This free land idea, Cam, I'm still mulling over it. For me, what I like though is the fact that you quantify the subsidies at 60 billion versus the 1/5 cost of at least giving them that land for 12 billion. That's the takeaway rather than the mechanics of that actually happening.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's right. I mean, what I really wanted to do is give you the chance to expand your thinking. Now that we're talking about free land, we can come back here to, land rent schemes and go, that's totally achievable. That's totally normal. We should do that. Cam's idea was crazy. We should do that. You see how now we've taken so many more steps tonight. So that's really what I wanted to do. Push the boundaries here to free land to make everything else seem possible.
Well, what a good way to learn.
Thank you.